We classify inputs into two main categories. The first category is our fixed inputs, and then the second category is our variable inputs. For fixed inputs are those type of inputs whose rate does not change based off of the output. A good example of this would be land. Let's say you go out and you buy land and you're making land payments, or you rent land and you've got lease payments. That lease payment or that land payment does not change based off of how many animals you have on there. So the amount of output can increase or decrease, but you're still paying the same amount in rent or in land payments. So this would be one where the land payments or the rate does not change based off of the amount of output, which in this case might be the number of cows. If you bring it back to farming, the land payment does not change based off of how much of a crop you produce in that given year. So the rate on fixed inputs stays the same regardless of output. The second type of input is a variable input. Now for variable inputs, the rates do change based off of the level of output. So an example of that might be fertilizer. If you want to increase output on a type of crop, you might often have to add more fertilizer. Well, as you add more fertilizer, it increased the cost, but it also increased output. So for variable inputs, the costs of those inputs change as output changes. Now in a perfectly competitive firm, the manager can only really control the variable inputs. And what they're trying to do is they're controlling the amount of variable inputs used into per unit of fixed factor. So if we look at this example where we're looking at variable inputs of fertilizer and fixed inputs of land, what the manager is trying to do is they're managing not the amount of land they produce. No, they used all of the land that they can feasibly use, but rather they're looking at how much input or how much of this variable input should I use? What is the correct amount of variable input or fertilizer that I'm going to use per unit of land? So in this case, you might hear, I'm going to use 5 pounds of fertilizer per acre, or 10 pounds, or 100 pounds, or something of that nature. So what this perfectly competitive firm manager is trying to do is they are managing the amount of variable inputs per unit of fixed input, or per unit of that fixed factor. So they might be looking at how many pounds of fertilizer per acre are we going to use. And then in a perfectly competitive firm, for them to maximize profits, what they are trying to do is they are trying to determine the amount of variable inputs trying to determine that exact amount. Exactly how much fertilizer am I going to use per acre to maximize my profits? They're not really concerned about how much land am I going to use to maximize my profits, because that cost is fixed. But rather they're going to say, how much of this input, of this variable input am I going to use? What is the profit maxing amount of this fertilizer that's going to give me the absolute highest profit that I can possibly make? What is the appropriate amount of fertilizer to maximize my profits, or appropriate amount of that variable input?